Ever get that feeling? Like you've stumbled upon a way of thinking that suddenly makes those big, really big questions about society, about knowledge, about values. I don't know, it's like they become clearer, sharper.
Oh, absolutely. It's like you've been handed this intellectual toolkit, right? And suddenly you can look at the world around you and it's like things start to snap into focus. That's a great way to put it. And that feeling, that sense of clarity of gaining a new perspective on things, well, that's exactly what we're all about here on the deep dive.
And for today's deep dive, we're going to be exploring a way of thinking that is all about bringing that kind of rigorous clarity to some really big, important ideas. We're talking about analytical Marxism.
Analytical Marxism, huh?
Yeah.
Now, I know for some people, when they hear Marxism, they might think, oh, isn't that like a thing in the past? But I assure you, this is something quite different.
Yeah, it's not your grandfather's Marxism.
Exactly. What analytical Marxism does is take those core Marxist concerns, those questions about capitalism, inequality, social change, those are all still very much relevant today. And it applies to them the kind of rigorous methods that you find in philosophy departments and social science research, that emphasis on logic, on clear argumentation, on evidence.
So it's kind of like taking those classic Marxist questions, those issues that Marx was grappling with, but looking at them through a modern lens, using the most up-to-date tools of analysis.
That's a great way to put it. It's about bringing that real analytical precision to those enduring questions. And for those of you out there who, like us, love to really get to the heart of complex topics quickly and thoroughly, well, this deep dive is for you. We're going to strip away all the unnecessary jargon, the fluff, and give you the key insights. No beating around the bush.
So who are the key players in this analytical game? The masterminds, the architects of analytical Marxism? Well, we've got some big names to talk about. G.A. Cohen, John Elster, John Romer. And Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, a defense, published in 1978, is often seen as a sort of, I don't know, a starting point for this movement.
Yeah, that book was a landmark. It really laid out a lot of the key ideas and the approach that would come to define analytical Marxism. And one of the things that's really interesting about analytical Marxism is how it defines itself.
How so?
Well, it very explicitly draws its inspiration, the substance of its ideas from Marxist traditions, those concerns about social justice, historical change, and so on. And this is key when it comes to the methods they use, the tools of analysis. They draw those from non-Marxist intellectual traditions.
So it's like saying, okay, we care about these Marxist problems, these issues that Marx brought to light, but we're not going to be bound by any particular Marxist dogma when it comes to how we analyze them. We'll use whatever tools work best wherever they come from.
Exactly. And that commitment to using the most rigorous analytical methods available, regardless of where they come from, is really at the heart of analytical Marxism. So to dive a bit deeper into those methods, what kinds of tools are we talking about?
Yeah, when we say analytical methods, what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, at the most basic level, there's a shared rejection of the idea that there's some kind of unique Marxist method, like there's a special Marxist way of doing analysis, some secret decoder ring for understanding the world. Instead, they take a much more pragmatic approach, embracing a whole range of analytical tools from mainstream philosophy, political science, economics, anything that helps them to make clear, well-supported arguments.
So no sacred cows.
No sacred cows. If logic helps, use logic. If game theory can shed light on something, use game theory.
So let's get specific. What are some examples of the tools they borrowed from these different fields?
All right, so from philosophy, they drew heavily on logic, really making sure their arguments are watertight, that they hold together logically. They also were interested in linguistic analysis, paying close attention to how language is being used, making sure they're defining their terms precisely.
They have philosophical precision.
Exactly. Then, from political science, they took things like decision theory and rational choice theory. These are ways of trying to understand how individuals make choices, especially in situations where there are trade-offs, where you have to weigh different options.
So, like, how do those individual choices then add up to create larger social patterns?
Right. And then from economics, they incorporated ideas from neoclassical economics. That's the kind of standard economics you learn in most introductory courses. And they also use game theory, which, again, is a way of analyzing strategic interactions, thinking about how people act when they know that their choices are going to affect other people's choices and outcomes.
So a real mix and match approach. It's like they built up this huge toolbox, taking the best tools from wherever they could find them. But with such a diverse set of tools, is there any, I don't know, underlying philosophy that unites them?
That's a great question. And Eric Olin Wright, who was one of the key figures in analytical Marxism, he actually tried to address that. He suggested that despite their apparent diversity, these methods all share some core commitments.
Like what?
Well, he pointed to this shared commitment to scientific norms, this emphasis on testability, on evidence, on reasoned argument. He also talked about systematic conceptualization, which is essentially about being very clear and precise about your terms, about the concepts you're using.
So no fuzzy definitions.
No fuzzy definitions allowed. Everything has to be crystal clear. And then he also talked about this commitment to fine-grained analysis, really breaking down complex issues into their component parts, trying to understand how all the different pieces fit together. And finally, he emphasized the importance of taking individual actions seriously, recognizing that social outcomes ultimately emerge from the choices that individuals make.
Okay, so it's about bringing that rigor and clarity to the study of, well, all these big social and economic issues that Marx was concerned with. And speaking of clarity, the rather colorful aspect of analytical Marxism that we have to talk about, their critique of what they call bullshit Marxism.
Ah, yes, bullshit Marxism. That's a term that always gets people's attention. And the story behind that term is actually quite interesting. There was this group of scholars, they initially called themselves the non-bullshit Marxism group. Later, they changed it to the slightly more formal September group. But that initial name really tells you something about their mindset. They even had this tongue-in-cheek coat of arms with the motto, Marxismus sine stercor tori, which is Latin for Marxism without the bull's well.
So they were serious about their mission, but not afraid to have a little fun with it, too.
Exactly. And that playful spirit was really just a reflection of their deep commitment to intellectual honesty. They were concerned that some Marxist writing had become, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly a model of clarity.
So they felt that some Marxist discourse had become, well, a little too full of hot air.
That's one way to put it. G.A. Cohen was particularly influential in developing this critique. He actually drew on the work of the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, who had written this really interesting book about, well, bullshit.
A whole book about bullshit.
Yeah, a whole philosophical treatise on bullshit. And Cohen took Frankfurt's ideas and applied them to academic discourse. His main point was that sometimes people engage in what he called unclarifiable unclarity. It's not so much that they're intentionally trying to deceive people, but rather that they produce arguments that are so vague, so muddled, that even they don't really know what they're saying.
Unclarifiable unclarity. That's a great phrase. It sounds like something we've all encountered at some point or another.
Yeah.
So who were the targets of this critique?
Cohen was particularly critical of certain trends in French intellectual culture, and especially what was known as Althusserian Marxism.
Why Althusserian Marxism specifically?
Well, Althusser was a very influential French Marxist philosopher, and his writing was notoriously dense and difficult to understand. And Cohen himself admitted that he had been initially drawn to Althusser's work because of its difficulty. He thought, wow, this must be really profound if it's this hard to understand. But eventually, he came to feel that Althusser's writing was more about obscuring meaning than illuminating it. He felt that the promised rigor and depth just weren't there.
So it was style over substance.
In a sense, yes. John Elster, another key analytical Marxist, he also expressed similar frustrations with Althusserian Marxism, particularly the way it used jargon and complex language to create the illusion of depth without actually delivering on that promise.
So it's a kind of intellectual smoke and mirrors.
Precisely. And Eric Olin Wright, he actually tried to lay out a more systematic account of what he called full-blown bullshit Marxism.
What were the hallmarks of this full-blown bullshit?
Well, he identified three main sins, so to speak. The first was obfuscation, which is essentially using overly complex language to obscure meaning rather than to clarify it.
So deliberately making things harder to understand than they need to be.
Right. The second sin was intellectual dishonesty, and this could take many forms, like refusing to clarify your arguments, or failing to acknowledge weaknesses in your own position, or just generally being unwilling to engage in good faith debate.
So it's not just about the clarity of the argument, but also about the process of argumentation, about being intellectually honest.
Exactly. And then the third sin was this kind of ideological style of argumentation, where the basic premise is that whatever Marx said is the final word on any issue. So instead of actually engaging in careful analysis and argument, you just appeal to the authority of Marx, like he's some kind of infallible prophet.
So it's about dogmatism, about treating Marx's writings as sacred texts rather than as starting points for further inquiry.
Precisely. And Cohen actually made a really bold prediction about this. He said that once analytical Marxism established itself as a clear alternative, All this pre-analytical Marxism would have to either shape up or ship out. It would either have to embrace analytical rigor or it would be exposed as, well, bullshit.
Strong words. So they were really setting themselves up as a kind of challenge to the existing Marxist orthodoxy. Now, beyond their methodological commitments, beyond this quest for clarity and rigor, what were the big substantive questions that analytical Marxists were wrestling with?
Well, their substantive concerns really mirrored those of classical Marxism to a large extent. They were interested in those fundamental questions about history, about class, about exploitation, but their analytical approach often led to quite different interpretations and refinements of those concepts.
Okay, so let's start with history. G.A. Cohen famously re-examined Marx's theory of historical materialism. What was his take on it?
Right, so Cohen, he really saw Marx's theory of history as fundamentally driven by the development of human productive power.
By productive power, you mean things like technology, tools, the skills and knowledge that humans use to produce the things they need.
Exactly. And he looked at Marx's 1859 preface, a contribution to the critique of political economy, and said, this is it. This is the clearest and most authoritative statement of historical materialism we have. And he built his whole interpretation around that text.
And what were the key elements of his interpretation?
Well, he laid out these key theses or propositions. There was the development thesis, which basically says that productive forces, those tools and techniques and so on, they have this inherent tendency to develop over time. Humans, by their very nature, are constantly trying to improve their means of production. Then there was the primacy thesis, which actually comes in two parts. The first primacy thesis says that the level of development of those productive forces, it explains the economic structure of society.
So like whether you have feudalism or capitalism or some other economic system, that's ultimately determined by the level of technology and productive power that you have.
Right. And then the second primacy thesis says that the economic structure, in turn, explains the superstructure, things like the legal system, the political system, ideology, culture. All of that is shaped by the underlying economic base.
So it's like a chain of causation. Productive forces determine the economic structure, and the economic structure determines everything else. But he also said that the explanation here was functional, right?
Yes, that's a key point. So a functional explanation basically says that something exists because of its effects, because of the role it plays. So in this case, Cohen is saying that the economic structure exists because it promotes the development of the productive forces.
Okay, so for example, if you have a certain level of technology, you need a certain kind of economic system to make the most of that technology, to allow it to flourish.
Exactly. And he actually gives an example of this. He talks about how as the productive forces develop, they eventually come into conflict with the existing relations of production. Like you might have a new technology that's making the old way of doing things obsolete. And he says this creates a pressure for revolution. You need a new economic system that can better accommodate those new productive forces.
So revolution is a way of resolving that tension, that mismatch between the productive forces and the relations of production.
Right. And he also outlines this four-stage model of history: primitive communism, ancient slave society, feudalism, capitalism. Each of these stages represents a different level of development of the productive forces and a corresponding set of relations of production.
Okay, so that's a very clear and structured view of history.
hmm
But I imagine this kind of, somewhat deterministic view of history probably generated some pushback, right?
Oh, absolutely. People had a lot to say about Cohen's interpretation of historical materialism. Some scholars were like, hold on, you're putting way too much weight on that one text, the 1859 preface. They argued that it didn't really capture the full complexity of Marx's thinking about history, especially his later work, which might be a bit more nuanced. And then there were some who were really concerned about the whole idea of this neat separation between the base and the superstructure. They're like, how can you really separate those things so cleanly? There's obviously going to be some back and forth, some mutual influence.
So it's not just a one-way street.
Right. And then there were also empirical challenges, people looking at actual historical cases and saying, well, hold on, the evidence doesn't really support this idea of a simple linear progression of productive forces always driving history forward. So while Cohen's work was really influential in clarifying certain aspects of historical materialism, it definitely wasn't the final word on the matter.
It sounds like it really sparked a lot of debate and rethinking about how we understand historical change. Now let's move on to another core Marxist concept: class. Eric Olin Wright really did a lot of important work on this. What were some of his key contributions?
Yeah, right. He was really committed to the idea that class was absolutely central to Marxist thought. And he defined class as an objective position within the system of production. It's about your relationship to the means of production, to the process of creating goods and services. And he actually laid out these 6 criteria that he thought any good Marxist analysis of class should meet.
Okay, 6 criteria. That sounds pretty comprehensive. What were they?
Well, first, he said class should be the basic determinant of class formations and struggles. So basically, if you want to understand why people form into different classes and why those classes come into conflict with each other, you have to look at their relationship to the means of production.
Makes sense.
Mm.
What was the second criterion?
The second one was that class should be the central organizing principle of social life. So not just about conflict, but about how society as a whole is structured and organized.
So class is kind of the foundation of everything else.
That's the idea. Then third, he said class should be relational and characterized by antagonism. So it's not just about individual attributes, it's about your position relative to other people, and it's inherently about conflict, about competing interests.
Okay, so far so good. What were the remaining criteria?
The fourth one was that class should be based on exploitation. So one class is benefiting at the expense of another. And then fifth, it should be rooted in the social organization of production. So again, it's not just about individual characteristics or choices. It's about the structure of the economic system, the way production is organized.
So it's about systemic inequalities, not just individual differences.
Exactly. And then finally, the sixth criterion was that class should be a concept that can be operationalized for empirical research. So it's not just an abstract philosophical category. You have to be able to actually measure it, to use it to study real-world societies.
Okay, so those are some pretty fundamental principles.
Wow.
But Wright is also known for his work on the complexities of class in modern capitalist societies,
Yeah.
right? Like, how do you even define class when you have all these different occupations, all these different levels of income and education?
Yeah, exactly. He was particularly concerned with this issue of the middle class because classical Marxism seemed to predict this polarization between the capitalists and the workers. But in reality, you have this whole range of people in between. And to explain this, he developed this idea of contradictory class locations.
Contradictory class locations, what does that even mean?
Okay, so the basic idea is that some people occupy positions in the economy that share characteristics of more than one class. So for example, think about a manager. They don't own the means of production, so they're not capitalists in the classic sense. But they do have authority over workers. They make decisions about how production happens, so in a way, they're kind of acting like capitalists. Or think about a highly skilled technician. They might have a lot of knowledge and autonomy in their work, which sets them apart from typical industrial workers.
So they're not fitting neatly into those traditional categories of capitalist and worker.
Right. And he initially tried to capture this complexity by looking at things like whether someone was self-employed, whether they supervised other workers, and so on. And he came up with this typology, this classification system with categories like managers, semi-autonomous employees, small employers, and so on.
So he was trying to develop a more nuanced picture of class structure, taking into account the real diversity of economic positions in modern capitalism.
Exactly. And later in his work, he really started to focus on the concept of exploitation as the key defining feature of class.
So it's not just about your position in the production process, but about whether you're benefiting from the labor of others.
Right. And he defined exploitation as basically inequalities in rights and powers over productive resources. So if you have more power to control the resources that are used to produce things, and you use that power to benefit yourself at the expense of others, then you're engaging in exploitation.
Okay, that makes sense. And did this focus on exploitation lead him to revise his typology, his classification of classes?
Yes, it did. He developed this more elaborate system with 12 different class categories based on different combinations of ownership of the means of production, organizational assets like having managerial authority, and credential assets like having a lot of education or specialized skills.
So a much more fine-grained analysis of class structure. But some people have argued that this focus on exploitation, especially on these different forms of assets, it kind of makes Wright's approach sound more like Weberian sociology, this like traditional Marxism, right?
Yeah, that's a common critique. And Wright himself acknowledged that there were some similarities to Weber's ideas about stratification, but he insisted that his approach was still fundamentally Marxist because it was grounded in this idea of exploitation, of one class benefiting at the expense of another. He argued that even these middle-class positions were still contradictory locations because their interests often overlapped and conflicted with both the capitalist class and the working class.
So it's a way of recognizing that the class structure is more complex than just a simple binary of capitalists and workers, but without losing sight of the fundamental power dynamics that underlie those relationships. Now, moving on to the third big substantive concern, exploitation. Both Cohen and Romer had some really interesting things to say about this.
Absolutely. So at the most basic level, exploitation involves one person or group benefiting unfairly from the labor or resources of another. And analytical Marxists, they were really interested in trying to rigorously define exploitation, to pin down exactly what makes it wrong.
And Cohen famously argued that you don't actually need the labor theory of value to make a moral argument against capitalist exploitation, right?
Exactly. That was kind of his big claim to fame, this idea that you can critique capitalism without having to rely on this really complex and controversial theory of value.
So how did you do that?
Well, he presented what he called the plain argument for exploitation. And it's basically this. Workers create value through their labor, right?
Yeah.
And then the capitalist appropriates a portion of that value in the form of profit. So the worker ends up receiving less value than they created.
It sounds pretty straightforward when you put it like that.
It is. And Cohen's point was that this basic idea that the worker is being shortchanged, that's the core of the moral critique of capitalism. You don't need this whole elaborate theory of value to get to that.
So it's a more direct ethical argument about fairness, about who's getting what they deserve. What about Romer? How did he approach the question of exploitation?
Romer, he was more interested in developing a really general theory of exploitation, something that could be applied to all sorts of different social systems, not just capitalism.
So a kind of universal theory of exploitation.
Right. And his theory was based on this idea of conditionally feasible alternatives. Basically, he said, a group is exploited if there's some other possible scenario, some other way of organizing society where they would be better off. And specifically, he was talking about scenarios where the exploited group withdraws from the existing social arrangement and takes with them their per capita share of society's productive assets, the stuff that's used to produce things.
So it's about comparing your actual situation to what you could have if things were organized differently.
Exactly. And he argued that in capitalism, workers are exploited because if they were to withdraw with their share of the means of production, the factories, the machines, and so on, they would actually be better off, whereas the capitalists would be worse off.
So it's not just that workers are getting a bad deal, but that they could be doing a lot better if the system wasn't rigged against them.
Precisely. But Romer also went on to argue that exploitation in and of itself isn't necessarily unjust.
Wait, what? How can exploitation not be unjust?
Well, his argument was that exploitation only becomes unjust if it's based on some kind of prior injustice in the distribution of assets. So if the capitalists got their wealth through fair means, through hard work or inheritance or whatever, then maybe it's okay for them to exploit workers.
But if you start out with a level playing field, then maybe exploitation is acceptable.
That was Romer's view. But not everyone agreed with him on that.
I imagine not. It seems like there's a pretty strong intuition that exploitation is wrong, regardless of how the assets were acquired in the first place.
Yeah, a lot of people had problems with Romer's argument. And there were all sorts of thought experiments and counterexamples designed to show that you can have wrongful exploitation even if there's no prior injustice in asset distribution. One famous example is this thing called the Pitt case, which was developed by a philosopher named Nicholas Vrousalis.
The Pitt case. What is that?
It's a bit of a weird thought experiment, but basically you have two people who are stranded in a pit. One of them, let's call her Alice, she's really strong and she can climb out. The other one, Bob, he's injured and he can't climb out on his own. So Alice says to Bob, okay, I'll help you get out, but only if you promise to work for me for the next year.
That sounds like a pretty raw deal for Bob.
It is, but the point is that there's no prior injustice here. They both ended up in the pit by accident, so it's not like Alice somehow unfairly acquired this advantage over Bob, but it still seems wrong for her to exploit his vulnerability in that situation.
So it challenges this idea that exploitation is only wrong if it's based on some kind of pre-existing inequality.
Exactly. And other analytical Marxists, like Alan Wood and Leah Youthby, they've explored different ideas about what makes exploitation wrong. Wood, for example, he's talked about the importance of vulnerability, that exploitation is wrong when it takes advantage of someone's vulnerability. And UP has talked about the role of domination, that exploitation is wrong because it involves one person or group dominating another.
So there's still a lot of debate about the exact nature of exploitation and what makes it morally problematic. But analytical Marxists were also interested in thinking about alternatives to capitalism, right? They didn't just want to critique the existing system. They wanted to imagine how things could be different.
Absolutely. And this is where they really broke with Marx himself, who was famously reluctant to engage in what he called utopian speculation. He thought it was more important to analyze the contradictions of capitalism and to understand the historical forces that were pushing towards its eventual demise. But analytical Marxists, they were like, no, we actually need to have a positive vision of what we're fighting for. We need to be able to articulate what a socialist society would look like and how we can get there.
So they were interested in socialist design.
Exactly. They wanted to figure out what values a socialist society should be based on and what kinds of institutions and policies could best realize those values.
Okay, so what were some of the key values they talked about?
Well, equality was obviously a big one. And Cohen, he developed this idea of socialist equality of opportunity, where everyone would have a fair chance to develop their talents and abilities, regardless of their social background. Then there was community, the idea that people should care about each other, that they should feel a sense of solidarity and responsibility for one another. Cohen, he was really big on this. Then there was democracy. And right, he emphasized the importance of broad and meaningful participation in decision-making, not just voting in elections, but having real control over the things that affect your life. And then there was individual freedom, although there was a lot of debate about exactly what that means in a socialist context. And finally, some analytical Marxists also talked about self-realization, this idea that people should be able to develop their full potential as human beings.
So a pretty wide range of values.
Yeah.
And did they actually try to come up with concrete proposals for how to create a socialist economy?
Oh, yeah, definitely. They weren't just armchair philosophers. Romer, for example, he came up with this really interesting model called coupon socialism.
Coupon socialism. What is that? Like a discount on groceries for socialists?
Not exactly. So the idea is that you would have publicly owned enterprises, the factories, the banks, and so on, but instead of being directly controlled by the state, they would be managed by sort of a stock market. And everyone would get an equal distribution of these non-transferable coupons that they could use to buy shares in these enterprises.
So instead of having private shareholders who own the companies, everyone would get a share of ownership.
Right. And then there would also be regular money, dollars, or whatever for everyday transactions. But the idea was that by giving everyone an equal share of ownership in the means of production, you could create a more egalitarian distribution of wealth and power.
It sounds like a pretty radical idea. Did it have any legs? Did anyone actually try to implement it?
Well, not exactly. There are a lot of practical questions about how it would actually work. Like, how do you prevent people from just trading their coupons on a black market? And there are also some concerns that it wouldn't really address some of the deeper problems with capitalism. Like, even if everyone owns the companies, you still have this problem of alienation, people working at jobs they don't really care about just to make a living.
So it might create a more equal distribution of wealth, but not necessarily a more fulfilling or democratic society.
Right. And Romer himself, he actually moved on from coupon socialism later in his career. He became more interested in thinking about the three pillars of a socioeconomic system: property relations, distributive ethic, and behavioral ethos. And he developed this idea of Kantian optimization, which is basically a kind of socialist behavioral ethos.
Kantian optimization. Sounds pretty complex. What does that even mean?
Well, it's based on Kant's moral philosophy, this idea that you should treat people as ends in themselves, not just as means to an end. So in a Kantian optimized society, people would be motivated by cooperation and solidarity, not by self-interest or competition.
So it's about changing the way people think and act, not just about changing the economic system.
Exactly. And another alternative that analytical Marxists were really interested in was basic income.
Basic income, that's the idea of giving everyone a regular, unconditional cash payment, regardless of their income or employment status, right?
That's it. And Philippe Van Parijs, he was one of the biggest proponents of this idea. He and Robert van der Veen, they actually argued that basic income could be a kind of capitalist road to communism.
Capitalist road to communism. That sounds a bit paradoxical.
It does, but their argument was basically that if you gradually implement a basic income, it would slowly reduce people's dependence on the capitalist labor market. And as people become less dependent on having to work for a living, they would have more freedom to pursue their own interests and to create a more just and democratic society.
So it's about using capitalism's own logic to undermine itself.
In a sense, yes. And Van Perez, he later developed a more philosophical justification for basic income based on this idea of real freedom. He argued that real freedom is not just about having the legal right to do things, but about having the actual capacity to do them. And he said that basic income would give people more real freedom, especially those who are currently at the bottom of society.
But basic income has also faced a lot of criticism, right?
Right.
Like, how do you pay for it? And isn't it unfair to give money to people who aren't working?
Oh, yeah. There's definitely been a lot of debate about basic income. The main practical concern is obviously affordability. Where does the money come from? And then there are ethical concerns about fairness and reciprocity. Is it fair to give people money without requiring them to work for it? And if so, under what conditions?
So it's still a very contentious issue. And Eric Olin Wright, he also offered some really interesting thoughts on socialist strategy, right?
Yes, he did. And he really went beyond that traditional dichotomy of reform versus revolution. He argued that there are actually many different ways to try to move beyond capitalism. He identified 5 different strategic logics that have been used historically.
5, that's a lot. What were they?
So first, there's the classic idea of smashing capitalism through a violent revolution. Then there's dismantling capitalism through a series of radical reforms. Then there's taming capitalism through regulation and welfare state policies. And then there's resisting capitalism through grassroots activism and social movements. And finally, there's escaping capitalism by building alternative economic systems outside the mainstream.
So a whole spectrum of strategies, from the most radical to the more gradual and incremental.
Right. And he also categorized these strategies in terms of their goals and their methods. So some strategies are aimed at neutralizing the harms of capitalism, while others are about transcending its structures altogether. And then, in terms of methods, there are ruptural strategies, which involve a sudden break with the existing system. Symbiotic strategies, which work within the existing system to try to change it from within. And interstitial strategies, which focus on building alternatives in the cracks of the system, so to speak.
So he's really mapping out the different ways that people have tried to challenge capitalism. And did he have a favorite strategy?
Yeah, he actually advocated for what he called an eroding capitalism strategy.
Eroding capitalism, what does that mean?
Basically, it's a long-term project that combines interstitial and symbiotic approaches. So you're building alternative institutions like worker cooperatives, community gardens, things like that. That's the interstitial part. And at the same time, you're using the state to try to expand proto-socialist forms and to regulate the excesses of capitalism. That's the symbiotic.